Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining us, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Dr. Victoria Coates, who is a distinguished fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, formerly senior advisor to Energy Secretary Dan Brulette, formerly also National Security Council member, among many other distinguished roles. Uh, Today we are discussing a foreign policy dilemma facing the Biden administration. As a result of its policies, we are seeing challenges on both defense fronts in terms of Russia and Ukraine, and of course, Iranian proxies in various parts of the world, and on the energy front, both domestically in terms of the prices and inflation, and on the foreign policy front in terms of the challenges to US relations with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other parties. We are going to discuss what's behind all of this, what can be done about it, and who benefits from these obvious failures. Dr. Coates, the floor is yours. What's your take on these recent developments? Where do we even begin?
Well, Irina, thank you for inviting me on. It's a very difficult time, obviously, because what we see here are a series of self-inflicted wounds by the Biden administration, which now they don't have an answer for. And what's been fascinating to watch is that they started on day one of the administration canceling the Keystone Pipeline and then advancing that broader policy to depress US domestic energy production as much as possible. And for those of us who were watching it over the summer, it was almost like watching a train wreck, because we were watching Vladimir Putin start to turn down his gas exports to Europe. So it's sort of like watching a frog being slowly boiled. So slowly he was creating an energy crisis in Europe to see how the United States and Europe would respond. And until about 3 weeks ago, the response was pitiful. And so I think that really invited then, as you said, his military aggression. So we have these twin problems of an energy crisis and a military crisis simultaneously.
It was fairly obvious that Europe's environmental policies that have led them to rely on completely unreliable methods of renewable energy extraction were bound to benefit actors that were seeking that sort of dependency. We're seeing the same slowly happen with the United States, unfortunately. But this, for years, this has been building up, and it's almost like Russia deliberately encouraged those type of policies, not only to benefit financially from the obvious dependency, but to build the stage for its aggression, for its attacks on both NATO and non-NATO members in Europe. We have seen that messaging for years prior to the current chain of events. What is it that prevented the previous administrations and Biden at the beginning of his term from taking this messaging seriously?
It's baffling because, Putin came out and said, as much as 10 years ago, that the American fracking revolution was a terrible thing and had to be stopped because it threatened his energy dominance of Europe. So he understands energy as a strategic tool. The Europeans understand energy as a commodity, and it has not occurred to them until recently that a hostile actor would use that commodity as a weapon to coerce their behavior. And in the previous US administration under President Trump, he made it a top priority to expand US domestic production as much as possible, which, however, ironically, is the best thing for the environment. Our gas is cleaner than Russian gas. we do a much safer and more efficient way of extracting these resources. So our emissions actually went down significantly during the Trump administration. But at the same time, our ability to both supply ourselves and to supply our partners and allies expanded. And the Biden administration did not recognize what an extraordinary leverage this gives the United States should the Russians decide, to act up, to do something aggressive against Europe, because I think the Biden folks decided that that wasn't possible, that the Europeans would, or the Russians rather, would respect them, and not invade Ukraine or any of their other neighbors. But that unfortunately has proven not to be the case.
Many of us are mystified by the goals of the Biden administration with respect to its energy policy, because in the previous gas spike preceding the most recent rise in prices, Biden turned to China for a release of gas to the market, which kind of undermines the entire purpose of cutting off US gas, since China is not known for its environmental friendly policy, and this kind of enables all the worst developments that Biden was allegedly trying to fight. And let's not even bring in Iran, who directly benefited from that particular turn of events and which is benefiting now. And Russia is likewise not known for its environmentally friendly history, either during the Soviet era or now. So why would Biden turn to the worst possible actors on climate, on environment for partnership, even as he destroys the policies that would actually benefit the environment at home?
It's really shocking. And I mean, I think you really put your finger on it in terms of this attempted partnership with the People's Republic of China as what the administration defines as energy consuming nations. They put us in that bucket, along with friendlier countries such as Japan and India. And I would be happy to partner with them, but as an energy producing nation. And we should be coordinating with fellow producers that are not named Iran or Venezuela or Russia. We should be partnering with Canada and Norway and Mexico and Saudi Arabia and UAE to create a stable, plentiful energy market. And this is perfectly possible. I mean, none of the nations, our friends that I just named, who happen to be part of OPEC, enjoy being part of OPEC. It's awful. So if the United States, as a producer, not as a consumer, would take a leadership role, we would have, I think, tremendous options for strategic global leverage in the energy market. But instead, they're running to partner with China. And it does all seem to come back to climate in the end, that they think that if they do this, they can somehow coax the Chinese into not being the biggest polluter on the planet, which they are right now. But they're showing absolutely no signs of doing anything of the sort. In fact, they're expanding their coal plant construction as we speak.
Indeed, this entire time, the administration's strategy approach to practically every one of these actors has been relying almost entirely on rather toothless diplomacy. For whatever reason, the understanding of the diplomacy of this administration is simply negotiation and talking without using any tools of leverage. Biden's hand was forced to change by other NATO and European Union members after Russia invaded Ukraine. But prior to that, even up until the last moment, there appeared to be no leverage at all being used, even at the point of direct threat of aggression, even when all the intelligence reports supported the intent to invade another country. Why is this administration so obsessed with diplomacy that has nothing to it, that has no economic or political consequences? We're seeing it with Iran, with China, with Russia, and we just now saw the administration approach Venezuela, promising to lift sanctions and begging them for oil. Where is the position of strength here?
Well, it's really for me, the most remarkable moment was in the middle of January when you had the Nordstrom 2 sanctions up in front of the United States Senate with bipartisan support. And the whole theory behind the Nordstrom 2 sanctions is that it is not a good idea to give Vladimir Putin a kill switch over European energy, which essentially that pipeline does. The arguments against it had gone back to Nord Stream 1 days under George W. Bush. And the Germans were just determined to do this and to pursue that pipeline. The United States saw it as just a terrible threat to our NATO allies in Europe. So you get legislation coming in front of the Senate with bipartisan support. And rather than just letting it pass, the administration sent senior folks up to the Hill to lobby Democrat senators against voting for it. So essentially, they are acting as Putin's lobbyists against sanctions on Nord Stream 2 because they don't want to upset the Iran deal negotiations going on in Vienna, which are the most, as you say, toothless diplomatic exercise on the planet right now. And it was so utterly backwards. And even the Germans, after the invasion of Ukraine, have awakened to the fact that this is a terrible idea, and they have frozen the final checks on Nord Stream 2. So at least gas isn't flowing through that blighted pipeline at the moment. But it makes absolutely no sense.
Now, I find all of this very ironic because the administration said that the reason we cannot currently provide more support to Ukraine than economic sanctions and some weapons that are being transported is due to a threat of escalation. But imagine a scenario where Ukraine falls and Ukraine has huge layers of uranium, lithium, not to mention gas. A fall in Ukraine invites Russia to install additional tactical nuclear weapons on the border with Poland and other European countries, and actually increases the potential for escalation against other NATO members and gives Russia more tools to increase its nuclear arsenal. Why would we ever want that to happen?
It's a terrible problem. And I think what we all need to grapple with is, when does this stop? Because, Putin has put everything on the table up to and including nuclear weapons. He took a rather extreme step of putting all of his nukes on alert right before the invasion. So he has signaled to the world that he is willing to contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. Now, I think no rational person, and I would like to count myself in that camp, has any interest in World War III. And I think the very stark response that you've seen from the Europeans are because enough people remember, or have relatives who remember, or had relatives who fought in World War II. My grandfather, for example, was second wave into D-Day. When my mother was 6 months old, that's not something anyone wants to go back to. And so I think the recognition of the reality of Putin's actions and his dramatic escalation and indication that he will escalate even higher has created, this very strong response. But it's not clear to me that the Biden administration has any kind of sense on their own minds, okay, do we need to take a stand in Ukraine so it's not Moldova or Montenegro or Poland? How long do we let this go on? And that doesn't seem, all they seem to be doing is taking things off the table, not creating any sort of our own guidelines.
There is every indication that Russia is contemplating opening a second, more proxy-based front in the Balkans, potentially with a plan to claim Kosovo. If that were to happen, that would absolutely automatically lead to an escalation right in the middle of Europe, and there would be nothing anyone could do to prevent that. What is the administration's plan for that eventuality?
Well, they haven't confided in me. The president has been very aggressive in his rhetoric about defending every inch of NATO. I agree that we have very serious obligations under the NATO Charter. In many ways, this has been a reinvigoration of NATO in terms of NATO refocusing now on its core mission, which is to defend continental Europe against Russian aggression. But I don't know how much confidence our NATO allies have at this point that the United States is truly going to be there if there is a military attack on a NATO ally. If we don't defend with Ukraine, are we really going to defend, the Balkans?
It seems to me that the administration is facing multiple challenges. On the one hand, it's losing its credibility without also getting a handle on the actual defense challenge, the fact that other NATO countries may become targets in the near future because Putin, far from backing away after fierce Ukrainian resistance, is inviting China to assist with weapons, inviting foreign fighters from various parts of the world to enter the country, and shows no sign of stopping. He is in fact issuing additional threats. On the other hand, the energy issue is not itself going away, and we are seeing a very bizarre response. The administration keeps on not opening the very obvious energy sources in the United States that would help bring the prices down. It's making demands from OPEC, from Saudi Arabia specifically, to release additional oil, and it has done so after continuing to essentially disregard security demands of these countries on which the entire relationship is built. What kind of results was the administration expecting? Why does it feel that anyone is going to play ball, given the fact that the administration is only using this opportunity to strengthen Iran?
Well, there are two pieces there that I'd like to unwrap a little bit. One is the energy issue with our Gulf partners, and the other is the Chinese angle and potential Chinese involvement in the conflict. And I'd start with the energy angle, and President Biden made a campaign stance during the 2020 campaign of labeling Saudi Arabia as a pariah. And was very aggressive in his rhetoric about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And he has been steadfast over the course of the first year of his administration, now year plus, that he would not speak to the Crown Prince, to MBS. He would only speak to King Salman. And there were disturbing reports today that this has left the administration with almost no leverage in Riyadh, which is a problem if you need more energy supplies. And we also saw reports today that the Saudis are considering taking payments for some of their energy shipments to China. China is Saudi's largest customer in yuan. I think those are just reports. I think it is just something they're signaling could be possible, but it's a very, very bad sign for the relationship. And the administration seems to think they still have the leverage to get the Saudis to pump more. But the problem is the Saudis understand the United States, rightly, to be one of the three biggest energy producers on the planet, along with Saudi Arabia and Russia. And so if you are a producer, Saudi Arabia, and you have another producer who's saying, we would like you to produce more, which will bring prices down, so you ultimately get less revenue. So you're doing this for strategic, not economic reasons. But yet that fellow producing nation, the United States, isn't ratcheting up production. And meanwhile is calling you a pariah. It makes no sense. And so, the historic value of the US alliance with Saudi Arabia, which goes back 70 years, and sure, there have been rough patches on both sides, but overall, I think we've mutually seen the enormous benefits of that relationship, the administration decided they could toss it out the window in pursuit of their Green New Deal aspirations, and suddenly have been mugged by reality.
And as far as China is concerned, they seem to benefit no matter which way things go. They benefit from the signaling from the Saudis because at the end of the day, even if it's just messaging, it still creates a platform for questioning the relationship with the US. It enhances divisions. It raises questions just how committed the Saudis are to the relationship, and it gives them additional room. They are building joint projects, joint missile and drone bases with Saudis that US is refusing to support from its end. And now with Russia and Ukraine, they also win either way. If Russia is strengthened, they get a stronger partner and they get a green light for their own ambitions regarding Taiwan and other parts of the world. And if Russia is weakened, it becomes more dependent on China, and China wins that way. What's the plan for tackling this potential for China as a result of this conflict?
Well, I might actually take a little bit of a different view of that, Irina. I think China actually has something of a problem on their hands. You had the meeting between President Xi and President Putin around the Olympics last month, in which they declared that they were going to have this limitless friendship and everything was going to be awesome. And apparently Xi asked Putin not to invade Ukraine until after the Olympics, which Putin obligingly did. But the international response to the invasion, and I'm not just talking sanctions or United Nations, Security Council resolutions, I'm talking about the actions of private companies. And so you've had everybody from Shell to McDonald's pull out of Russia. You've had the Russian stock exchange closed now going on 3 weeks, and they can't reopen it because if they reopen it, it will have zero value. You've had Russia largely cut off from the international financial system. So they are going to be forced to employ the Chinese digital system, which isn't great for the Russians. And so I think from Xi's perspective, maybe he's gotten himself a kind of a client state here with enormous natural resources, yes, and a lot of strategic real estate, but there's a lot of stink all over it. And we've seen some interesting things happen over the last couple of weeks where you've had athletes like the Belgian soccer star Lewandowski reject his Huawei endorsement. I mean, and that's a lot of money for a soccer player, but he voluntarily said, I don't want to wear that jersey. I don't want that name on my back, because Huawei helped in Ukraine. They run the 5G network and they contributed to the Russian surveillance of the folks they're trying to target in Ukraine. And so it looks on the surface like something of an advantage for China, but I'm curious to see over time how all that plays out.
I think one of the questions many people had as a result of the recent publicity regarding the crisis is whether the US would take, and others would take same or similar actions against China. So far, China has not as brazenly attempted to re-engage Taiwan as Russia has tried to take over Ukraine, but nevertheless, it has engaged in a lot of other activity that many people naturally find exceptionally offensive and illegal and unethical, and yet has been met with relatively muted reaction from both the administration and the private sector. What do you think is likely to happen next? Will this opportunity weaken everyone's dependence on China and help push the world in the direction of different actors in the relationships, or do you think this is just a temporary situation, and at the end of the day, China is just too embedded everywhere to for this particular crisis to make much of a dent?
Well, I think that's going to be the critical question. And I think you have a lot of folks who are waking up to the fact that it is not great to depend on Huawei for your 5G networks. And it is really bad to depend on China for any kind of digital banking. I mean, this is why China has rejected any kind of crypto in favor of their own central bank digital currency, which they can of course control. And you can imagine if you go to a developing country and you say, oh, okay, here we are, if you just embrace the digital renminbi, the digital Chinese currency, we will pretty much give it to you for free. But then of course China has control and insight into every single financial transaction that any of your citizens make and that you make as a government. So it's an amazing control factor. But I would say it is now looking a lot less desirable because people can see how it's being used as a coercive device. And I think now it is really the role of the United States and our partners and allies. And yes, we have to partner, I think, much more aggressively with our private sector to offer alternatives. When we came in as the Trump administration and everybody was saying, well, we have to just accept Huawei 5G and then 6G and whatever comes after. And we said, wait a minute, why don't we have an alternative? Well, it's because the Chinese have put all of our businesses that did that out of business very deliberately and tried to create a situation where there were no US or allied options. Now, fortunately, we could put a stop to that. We have, a system which involves Samsung and Ericsson, as well as some US companies that's an alternative, but we were playing a pickup game there. It never should have happened. So in these other critical fields, besides communication, we have to be very aggressive in saying, this is not the only option. And it may be cheaper. The bottom line might look better right now, but it's a hell of a lot more expensive in the long run. So you really should go with the gold standard, which would be a US or allied product.
All of this raises questions about the Chinese surveillance state model, which was seemingly on the rise everywhere, including even to some extent the United States. Right before the invasion, there was a lot of concern about the role of social media giants in controlling social responses and behavior, the role COVID played in all of that. All these social behavior issues being tied to. We even had airlines asking for the US government to create a universal no-fly list for quote-unquote bad behavior, which could range from aggressive behavior to not wearing a mask or dropping the mask or whatever, or wearing the wrong sort of t-shirt or anything else. Do you think these current events will push back, create more of a pushback against these policies? Do you think we're just temporarily distracted by a crisis and things will go back to the same direction as soon as there's some clarity on what's happening?
I think it's fascinating. I've been reading a lot about that recently, and I think we have a lot of leaders, both in Congress and amongst some of our governors, who are pushing back against this. And, everybody was deeply concerned about the pandemic and wanted to combat it as much as possible. But, if you go back and kind of trace 2020 and, what was supposed to be, everyone's going to stay home 2 weeks, and suddenly it turned into 2 years. And, now you have, still very aggressive policies in place, mandating masks in certain places, mandating vaccines. But I think the American people are really standing up and saying, this is not what we are about as a country. And as unfortunate and unpleasant as the Omicron variant sort of spike in COVID cases was, it also showed us that it is possible to weather a spike, with the vast majority of people being vaccinated, so not getting very seriously ill, and that the cases then drop off, almost like a cliff. And so I think it's enormously important for us as Americans right now to not just kind of just turn the page from what happened over the last 2 years, but really re-examine it, re-examine the emergency powers that a series of governors, gave themselves and then re-upped over and over again to be able to act however they wanted, regardless of the views of their citizens or their legislatures. And I think we got to a pretty dangerous place. And it is very, very important that we look back at that very clearly and make sure that does not happen again.
Unfortunately, these last few years have lent themselves to not only a great deal of polarization overall, but the fact that people seem to be getting the information from such vastly different sources that it becomes very easy climate to maneuver, manipulate, and mislead. And we've seen an increase of that during the pandemic, and now we are seeing a lot of the disinformation related to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and it's a national security issue. The use of disinformation by active measures to manipulate public opinion and to achieve particular foreign policy goals, it's absolutely a danger to us, and yet there seems to be no angle on how to restore public trust in any particular source of information, including the US government. What's the answer to this really critical issue?
It's kind of a new frontier in terms, as you say, of national security, where information has become weaponized. And you have, a situation like in Russia where they're just insisting on the public government controlled outlets that, that the Russian soldiers are being welcomed as liberators in Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian government is a bunch of drug addicted Nazis. And they just keep repeating it over and over again. And I'm sure you saw there was the amazing video last night of somebody who was a presenter on one of these television stations, holding up a sign saying this is a lie. And so you are having some internal defections, but the problem we have as the United States government is, we very proudly have a free press, and we don't want to engage in propaganda, and we don't want to be seen as manipulating information. But at the same time, we have to get our information out. And one of the more interesting things I did at the end of the Trump administration was run the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which is a $700 million a year government funded program that most Americans have never heard of, because they're prohibited from broadcasting into the United States. So, we have this extraordinary tool to get information out to the Middle East, but the taxpayers who are funding it don't get to see what it's doing and don't get that information. And we don't even brand it as American. We brand it as the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. So it's a frontier on which I think we have a ton of work to do. I think it should be a bipartisan effort to create, again, a gold standard of information and transparency, and figure out how we're going to compete with this. And I think in many ways, the very ham-handed Russian approach to Ukraine and the enormous success of the Ukrainians in grabbing the public relations space should give us hope that we can do this.
Unfortunately, you just brought up something important, because Russia has been targeting the Middle East with the propaganda efforts and trying to exploit the poor image of the United States at the moment to basically cast US perception and US actions in a deceptive light, to put it mildly. And that sort of aggressive campaigning requires an aggressive pushback, but I'm not seeing it from any sort of US response. In fact, US seems to have abandoned the fight for public opinions abroad in general. The Eastern European version of the same project has not been actually broadcasting on shortwave into Ukraine. So the US government seems to be falling behind on these communication issues. We are seeing private actors like Elon Musk and Anonymous, a collective of hackers, for lack of a better word, pick up what US should be doing in terms of addressing cyber and communications issues. And if the US government cannot keep up with basic communications on basic security issues, how can it actually handle diplomacy? Right now, we are facing a crisis with multiple countries. We are facing a crisis of communications with Israel, which has tried to be accommodating, but nevertheless is extremely concerned about the Iran deal. We are facing a crisis with Saudi Arabia and UAE, where the leaders are literally not picking up the phone for the US president. Where do we even begin to kind of rebuild trust and rebuild this sort of relationship that will reintegrate US back into a position where it can have positive influence?
Well, the good news is that we've gone through some pretty wretched times in the past and have managed to reemerge on the other side. And you can think about something like what it looked like our position was vis-a-vis Egypt in 1972 when Nasser died, and Egypt looked like it was pretty much just a vassal state of the Russians at that point. And suddenly, after Nasser died, Anwar Sadat became president and made the really historic decision to turn towards the United States and to make peace with Israel. So it can happen. That the bad news on that front is that it takes a lot of work. And this administration does not seem terribly interested in the kind of relationship building, trust building that is required to have a serious position in the Middle East and beyond. One thing you mentioned that I did want to touch on is Elon Musk's new Starlink independent internet satellite provider, which is one of several potential platforms for this, which should be, in my mind, one of the top priorities of the administration and the Congress, to be able to pipe open internet anywhere we want. So imagine if we could have done that in 2009 in Iran. Imagine if we could have done it around the Olympics in Beijing. It's our brand. It's basically exporting free speech. And we developed the technology around Hurricanes Harvey and Maria when the government needed to be able to get internet to places in Puerto Rico and even on mainland continental United States where internet service was disrupted. But it's such an extraordinary capability, and so why we wouldn't be just developing that and through USAID, so it's clear it's not an act of war. You're just exporting free speech. To me, that's a no-brainer and something we should definitely be pursuing.
Unfortunately, the administration keeps making really questionable decisions on many fronts, and all of them end up putting us in a position of not being perceived as reliable in any sense, whether on energy or on defense. The Afghanistan withdrawal was an unmitigated disaster, which we have since tried to distance ourselves from, while Afghanistan is suffering from a humanitarian crisis. Yemen remains an equal disaster. Now the EU Commission finally designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization. The UN panel recently described Houthis as a terrorist group, although it was not a formal designation, but they did place a symbolic arms embargo. But still, we are seeing that the Iran deal, which was suspended due to Russia's demand, seems to be moving in the same direction of absolute accommodation and rather than taking a lesson from the recent pushback by various actors, Biden seems to be interested in lifting RGC from the terrorist list among other troublesome actors. How do you think that's going to play out? Do you think Congress will be able to put a stop to all of this?
Well, they can do some things, and I think you mentioned the Houthi and putting the Houthi on the foreign terrorist organization list through the State Department, the Treasury Department, was something we worked on for years, and the Trump administration only got it done at the very end. But it was something that the president definitely wanted to do. The argument against it, which was the argument that the Biden folk used to take them off the list last February and March was that it would hinder humanitarian aid from getting into Yemen. Well, taking them off the list in no way has helped increased humanitarian flow into Yemen as much as I think we would all like to see that happen, except for the Houthi, of course. And their behavior has only gotten worse. They've been shelling both UAE and Saudi, and they're losing civilians. The administration's response has been muted at best. I think that has also contributed to the problems in those relationships. And then you also touched on, one of my proudest moments on the National Security Council staff, which was the designation of the Islamic Republican Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, which was something that had also been on the table for a number of years and had been resisted by various elements in the United States government because they were concerned that our military might be also similarly designated by foreign governments. But the point that we eventually made and the case that was built about the IRGC in particular is that they no longer were functioning simply as state sponsors of terrorism. They were state participants in terrorism. They were actually carrying out terrorist acts. And that case became so solid that even those who resisted the action had to agree that the evidence was there, that they deserved to be so designated. And it was a very helpful tool for us in terms of freezing assets and stopping folks from traveling, and hopefully saving lives and preventing terrorist attacks. And the notion that the Biden administration, in their just blind pursuit of a new version of the JCPOA, would rescind that designation, not on the grounds of any hard evidence, but just because they want to get back into a deal. So it's an accommodation, it's an appeasement they can offer Tehran, is just shocking. And all it will do is lead to, as it did with the Houthi, lead to more terrorist attacks.
Now, recently, this development was overshadowed by Putin's overtures that led to the invasion. But shortly prior to this turn of events, the Biden administration welcomed Qatar as a major non-NATO ally, despite the fact that Qatar refused to participate in NATO exercises that involved Israel, and despite the fact that it's under the DOJ investigation for funding RGC, which is for now still a terrorist organization. One particular aspect of this relationship was Biden asking Qatar to assist with the energy crisis, but according to European investigations, Qatar is one of the contributors, part of a gas cartel along with Russia, and a major investor in Russia's energy sector. Right before the recent developments, $11 billion support for banking and so forth. What is the impetus about choosing this particular country at this particular moment to do actions when its role has been at best controversial and at worst suspect in assisting some of the worst actors with their acts of aggression around the world?
Well, I think you and I might have something of a rare divergence of views on Qatar, in that, I would not see this as a black and white situation between UAE and Saudi on the one hand and Qatar on the other. I think they have been an extremely valuable security partner on a number of fronts, where I think the Biden administration approach is bizarre, is that they have very aggressively partnered with the Qataris on Afghanistan and on a series of other issues, while being extremely distant and hostile to the Saudis and UAE. I happen to see them all as partners that have various strengths. I am happy that they are coordinating much better than they were during rift times, because that created all sorts of complications. I understand the concerns about some of these issues, and I think they are something we would do better to work with the Qataris on. But I think what the administration is finding is that you can't, on the one hand, partner very closely with one Gulf state and then suddenly treat the other two like pariahs. And they haven't been particularly friendly to the Bahrainis either. So I think overall, it's just an inconsistent approach to an incredibly important, complicated part of the world that has left everybody deeply confused and, and concerned about what the United States intentions are.
Amidst all of this, that also raises the question about the future of the Abraham Accords. Not that any of the current partners are about to jump ship. My question is more about the US role in all of this. US was supposed to be the big backer and advancer of the project that it was very much a part of. Now we are seeing at best silence and inconsistent statements with regards to what's going on. And now with the UAE and the Biden basically not on talking terms, that raises a question of what will the US role be in the future? Can it help advance these relationships? If so, to what end? How can it bring any new partners to sign on to these important agreements if it can barely maintain the relations with the existing members?
Well, sadly, I think from this administration, the best we can hope for is benign neglect for the Abraham Accords. I wish they would just ignore them. Just do no harm is my hope, because it's been the most beneficial thing that's happened in the region for 25 years. And even if you go back to 79 or 94, the deals with Egypt and Jordan, neither of those would have been even remotely possible without the intervention of the United States. And the Abraham Accords are different in that they are not exclusively security pacts. Obviously, there's a security element, but they also are cultural and economic. And the upside for both partners, both the Israelis and the Moroccans and the Bahrainis and the Emiratis, have been so obvious that they've continued to support them. And, from the private sector, that's something, I'm trying to do as much of as I can for the time being. Congress has been extremely forward leaning on it, which is terrific. And, you have a situation like we saw last week where the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said in an interview, Israel is not an enemy. There's potential relationship with Israel. And I think, the changes that are happening in the kingdom that I've been able to witness, personally over the last couple of years are quite dramatic. And I would posit that encouraging, the Saudis, the Omanis, there are a number of other candidates to start looking at what this would mean for them and for their populations and for regional prosperity and security. Would be a great good the administration could do. They don't seem particularly interested in that. As you pointed out, they're much more interested in an Iran deal. They seem much more interested in talking to the Palestinian Authority. That's their choice. They're the ones who are in power. And hopefully, as I said, the countries themselves will kind of keep this process going until we have another US administration that's really interested in playing a leadership role.
And while we're on the subject of these important alliances, Prime Minister Bennett recently revitalized the idea of MESA, or Arab NATO, an alliance of Arab allied countries, in particular against regional threats such as Iran. How would the administration look on that? Wouldn't that be a direct challenge to Iran? And if so, what difficulties can we expect from this side? And what is the plan to help protect these allies from Iranian aggression, which is sure to unleash as soon as any sort of agreement is concluded?
Well, you're absolutely right there, and you can see a direct corollary in 2014 and 2015 when the Obama administration started relaxing all the sanctions on Iran, between the sanctions relief that they received and their military spending. All of it went into into military applications, everything from what they called their civil nuclear program to their missile programs to their their regional proxies to the IRGC's terrorist activities. So we know that's what they're going to do again the minute they start getting these resources. And I think all of our partners and allies are rightly deeply concerned about that, especially given the perceived weakness of the United States. And one of our key projects that we didn't get across the finish line in what you might call the first Trump term was the Middle East Strategic Alliance, or MESA, which would have been the GCC plus Jordan and Egypt looped together in an economic and political as well as a security regional arrangement, which now potentially could involve Israel in a much more formal role. One very good thing I will give the Biden administration credit for not getting in the way of that we initiated was getting Israel into CENTCOM. So as the US military looks at the world, Israel, rather than bizarrely being in Europe, which was the case until last September, is now part of CENTCOM, which is where the rest of the Middle East is as it interacts with the US military. And so now with Israel in CENTCOM, with the Abraham Accords, that becomes much more possible. And you could see how the historic US investment in Israel's security could be leveraged to provide greater security to the region and to its great benefit and to its stability. So getting back after MESA, particularly if we are in a position, or we are now in a place where we're seeing a revitalization of NATO and the attractiveness of having these kinds of collective security agreements in other areas, that could be a huge opportunity.
Alas, the Biden administration has not been particularly receptive to other projects such as the EastMed pipeline that would have provided some measure of coordination on energy issues between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. Instead, it's been interestingly pushing Turkey as a partner, both with Israel, with Kurds in Iraq, and other players. That may ultimately be seen as an anti-Russian move, but still doesn't resolve the question why other projects have been basically remain unsupported. But ultimately, all of this leaves all involved, friends, foes, and everyone in between, with the ultimate question: what is the US future in the region, in the Middle East, around the world, if every 4 years, 4 to 8 years, the power changes radically, and that affects everybody in a very radical way? We have seen tremendous differences between Obama and Trump and Biden, and we don't know what to expect from future administrations. How can we answer that question? How can we reassure our partners that having a republic, having a liberal democracy is not a bad thing, that there is some level of issues that our governing bodies can still agree upon? Because increasingly that seems not to be the case, and it raises questions whether why should many states even bother partnering with us on anything?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. And I think in a way, if we all agree that the generational security challenge that we face is the People's Republic of China, that does seem to have bipartisan support in the way that opposition to the Soviet Union had bipartisan support during the Cold War, and that can focus the attention pretty clearly. And if you go back to the 60s and 70s, the shift from Kennedy and LBJ to Nixon and Ford to Carter to Reagan was a similar kind of very herky-jerky change in policies. But one thing about Carter that's not, I think, broadly appreciated is that in 1979, when they started facing a series of crises from the Russian invasion of Afghanistan to the Islamic Republic in Iran, they actually started to shift policies. And I know this from, from my work with Secretary Rumsfeld, because he was Secretary of Defense in 75 and 70, or 76 and 77, before Carter came in. And what he watched then from the private sector during that administration was them turn all the taps in the other direction at the Pentagon, had these crises, and then desperately tried to turn them back. Now, that's not an ideal state of affairs, but what I would hope is that even, if folks can see beyond the personalities and just see the value of policies of things like the Abraham Accords, which are just a good thing. It shouldn't be a partisan thing. It's just a good thing. It's good for America. It's good for the region, that we can get beyond some of this rancor and focus instead on what are just common sense, good policies for the United States.
It seems at the end of the day, it all comes down to less politics itself and more political culture, a lot of communication, a lot of ideological shifting that needs to be handled on levels that I think are beyond immediate political goals. There's only so much the government can do. It can fund or not fund certain things. It can partner with particular entities. What it cannot do is do the jobs of individuals and Americans for them in that regard. So there is that work to be done, and that argument needs to be reiterated to everyone over and over again. But even with all these challenges, I am glad to hear that there is hope for the future. That as bad
There's
as
always hope for the future.
as bad as things may seem, we've managed to overcome bad challenges in the past and grow from them. I'm hoping this is what will ultimately happen, and these stumbling blocks are not permanent. They're just that. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us was Dr. Victoria Coates and her fascinating insights on the defense and energy challenges and failures and possibility of successes that we are facing as a country today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irina.